I believe this is so important is because in general, there's a whole lot of misconception about palletization. There are a lot of really confusing guidelines that come from a variety of vendors, whether you're working with Amazon or Overstock, Wayfair.com. Just a lot of the resellers are putting their own spin on what can be packaged with a pallet, what should be shipped without a pallet, and there isn't a whole lot of whys and rationalizations behind it. So I've been at both ends. I've obviously worked on behalf of manufacturers and importers who want to use pallets or who are seeing damages as a result of using pallets. And I've also worked on behalf of the transportation companies that either do or don't prefer the pallets, depending on what type of company they are and the equipment they use. And from a third point of view, I've also worked for the retailers, and often they're the ones who control the transportation. They pay for the transportation, bring the customer, and deal with the customer service side of things. And so everyone kind of has a hand in this honeypot, and it's still unclear as to whether it truly benefits, well, hopefully it will become clear to everyone after this presentation, but for a lot of folks, unfortunately, it's not clear as to how they should design a palleted load, whether pallets are the right way to go for their products, and then how to, if they need to rebut one of these other people sticking their fingers in the honeypot, how to rebut an argument against or pro pallets when it doesn't benefit their products. So I just want to make sure that all your questions about palletization are answered. So today we're going to talk about, obviously, definitions of what types of pallets there are. I'm going to quickly talk about network requirements. And I apologize, I put definitions on there twice, but we might have some more definitions. We have some palletization methods in terms of how to correctly build different loads, etc. And then I also want to quickly talk about alternatives to wooden pallets. I've actually dealt with two different clients in the past week who have reached out to me in regards to whether wooden pallets are the way of the future or whether there's a more sustainable method that might be cheaper, way less, etc., that might be able to be used more frequently. And I do want to touch on that, recognizing that it's more of a packaging conversation in regards to the specific products instead of just being general palletization and load capabilities. But again, if you guys have questions, use that chat window. I want to hear from you all. It's I certainly don't want to have you guys leave and feel like your questions haven't been answered, or either there are parts of packaging that you have more questions about. So please let me know what I can help with. As a quick introduction, going backwards in this slide, obviously there are a lot of different people from different industries on this call, so it's kind of a general, what is palletization, why is it useful, etc. You heard my intro. And then my name is Daniela, or Danny. I'm the manager and the owner of Protecting Packaging Consulting, and I have worked in different industries in the past, so I understand the pros and cons to the cost and the optimization and the conversation about equipment. I get it, and I'm trying to work on behalf of you guys with whatever you need to be able to find both education that benefits you, but also solutions that I can give you that you don't have to go out and learn the hard way by damaging your inventory or having claims brought against you. So I certainly want to avoid any loads coming in looking like this to anyone or anywhere. So to start, I want to first talk about using, like, the pros and cons, or just general information about network requirements. So it looks like we're doing network requirements, then we're doing definitions. I apologize about the typo in the agenda slide. So I do want to talk about, in general, like, regardless of what type of pallet, the fact that you're using pallets. So especially in the past 2 years, Wayfair.com, Amazon, Room and Board, Williams-Sonoma, there have been a whole lot of e-commerce players that have been pushing towards removing pallets out of the supply chain entirely, from your distribution facility to the customer's home. And the reason that this is becoming more and more prominent is because there are more touch points, maybe not necessarily touch points, that was an error on my side. I should say there are more people or methods involved in delivering a product nowadays. And so before it was, you're sending an LTL, the LTL truck, like a 40-footer or 53-footer trailer is going to wind up outside of your house. There's going to be a truck driver who calls or rings your doorbell and says, get this thing off my truck, get this couch off my truck. And your job was to figure out, like, bring your buddies out, offer them a case of beer and get it off their truck and then get it into your house. Over time, it has moved into a more customer-focused and customer-centric point of delivery. So you either have a smaller box truck come and deliver the goods that might have a lift gate. You have an actual moving company or delivery company delivering the item inside your home, potentially installing it or assembling it. So it's really moved both into the home and become more customer-centric. And because of that, now folks are saying customers don't want the pallets. They don't want the pallets coming into their home, and it takes a lot of time to remove things from pallets. So in the interest of increasing efficiency, speed, and preventing the customer from waiting on a driver to cut their product off of a pallet, they're saying just remove the pallets entirely, or we'll remove them for you before we deliver this item. And unfortunately, whether your item needs to stay on that pallet or not, if it looks like it can come off a pallet and get a hand truck to move it around, it probably will in those cases. There are exceptions. So extremely heavy products that are in one carton, so things like a huge marble vanity, 72-inch vanity, a giant hot tub, a shipment of tile, for instance, products and shipments with over 3 cartons going to the same customer. So if you've ordered a pallet worth of tile, so you might have 16 cartons, each they're 40, 46 pounds, or 45 pounds a piece, and so that could potentially take like 6 to 10 trips back and forth in and out of a customer's home. And in those cases, the delivery method might be altered. It might absolutely stay on a pallet in that case. I would say there's a better chance of it staying on a pallet than it coming off a pallet. And products that are requiring A-frame pallets. So that one's a kind of hit or miss in terms of whether it's going to be removed from a pallet. But in those cases, if your product legitimately needs help standing up and needs to stay in a certain orientation, having a right-sized pallet that fits correctly to keep it upright, like an A-frame solution, absolutely might lead to your product getting all the way to the customer's home on a pallet. So I say this, and I recognize it's a lot of information. Most of you might be wondering, like, this is bizarre. I've never heard this. Of course, I'm putting all of my stuff on pallets when it ships LTL or FTL. Why wouldn't we put it on a pallet? And my overall reasoning for this is to, again, explain, like, there are more carriers who are realizing that Cube can be further expanded and utilized if pallets are not underneath products. It's easier to stack products. It's easier to get away with stacking products. And frankly, this has been going on for years, for decades. You may not realize it, but over time, if you shipped your product out with more than 1/3 of the pallet unused, most likely that product was either coming off the pallet and getting combined on another pallet, even if it's not going to the same customer, like the carrier, your shipper is actually doing that. So like a Conway Freight or a YRC, like they were doing that. They are still doing that. And in addition, you have similarly, I should say, before I move on to the next point, you have truckers, if you have an enormous amount of pallets and not enough truck space, you might try to figure out ways to stack it. If I put these 2 boxes together on a pallet or on the floor, I can put a load on top of them because it won't topple over. On top of that, talking about toppling over. These pallets have a lot of room between them. I can't fit another pallet in. If I remove this other pallet if I remove another product from a pallet, I can stuff it between these two loads so they don't fall over and cause any tipping issues with the trailer. And hopefully nothing gets damaged if I do that. And so these trucking companies, through no fault of their own necessarily in some cases, they are removing, they're combining pallets to make their trucks house these things more efficiently and to make each load optimized per the run. It's also kind of difficult when some carriers don't know whether to expect pallets or not, especially for these e-commerce e-tailers that are sending a lot of these different truck drivers information of like, you need to go to these 12 facilities to pick up today, but they don't necessarily know if the order has been registered on a pallet. The truck driver just assumes it'll fit, and when it doesn't, they get to stop 10. They're like, shoot, we still have 2 more stops to go, and this filled up our truck. That's when they're probably going to start making the executive decision and just trying to puzzle piece their trucks together. Especially if there's space wasted in their shipping air because your product is on a pallet that's not the correct size. That's when, things get a little interesting. So there's been this movement over the past, I would say, 3 to 5 years that more trucks have been offering service, more trucking companies have been offering pallet-free services. You give it to us without a pallet, we better optimize our loads, and we will handle it in a better fashion because we're using hand trucks and dollies instead of using forklifts, which have motors and are sending tons of steel through your product potentially. So there's always obviously a risk of damage, whether you have a product on a pallet or whether it's floor loaded. And with the floor loading, you do still run a risk of damage, bridge damage with long items or large items. Potentially the stacking methods are going to be a little unorthodox with a bunch of products in the LTL environment going into a back of the trailer and being all sorts of odd shapes and sizes. With pallets, it may not have been as prominent, but as I said before, most likely there was still an element of products coming off pallets and then or hopping onto pallets that were the better size for them or deemed a better size for them. And there were still some elements of this going on, that there were manual lifts instead of forklifts. There were dollies being used instead of keeping the item on a pallet, et cetera, even in the palletized environment. On the floor-loaded side, those same risks still apply, and those boxes are now less protected because they don't have the potential of having this pallet underneath them. But there's a huge benefit to better jigsawing a trailer together and filling it up, because your products may not move as much, and the less movement, for those of you who have joined previous webinars, the less movement there is in your box, around your box, in a truck, the better it is for your product, and the likelier it is for it to arrive damage-free. It's becoming more common in the LTL environment that lighter products that are under 200 pounds and can be easily lifted with 2 people ship without a pallet. And products, even if your order, let's say you've ordered a treadmill and it comes in 2 parts, or I should say 2 separate cartons, even though there's a potential that one of those cartons will not arrive at the same time as the other carton, that risk is becoming lower and lower as more of these final mile delivery facilities become more technology-based, where they can check in how many cartons came in for an order, confirm that they're all there before scheduling a delivery to a customer. And there's much more adept technology that's adept at tracking these individual cartons throughout the entire network. And so even if you lose one before, you'd have to do doc searches. You wouldn't know where this thing is for months. Now you know that this tracking number got scanned in on a certain date at a certain time in a certain location, and your 2 boxes for your 1 treadmill may arrive at the Florida distribution facility on different days, but still get to the customer on the same day during the same delivery. So, and again, you don't need a pallet to keep them together. So the whole point of this slide is to explain that there are pros and cons to both methods. There is a reasoning as to why the floor loading method has become more prominent nowadays, and the most impactful reason for it has been utilization. Secondly, becoming more so of a, we are going to create this better customer experience where even if it's going through an LTL trucking service, that final mile delivery is going to be handled by a moving company, someone who's very good at handling products without pallets. Therefore, let's eliminate pallets entirely and then better optimize the cube in the truck. So it's a little bit of a cycle, vicious cycle there. So I'm going to go into types of pallets. This is where I'm going to get into the more packaging piece, the side of things, and go through explanations, and then we can discuss kind of if you're going to use pallets, what type of pallets to use, etc. So the rest of this is actually devoted to pallets and assuming that you want to continue trying to push your products to stay on pallets and ship on pallets as opposed to removing them. So the different types of pallets, you have stringer pallets, and the stringers are boards that move all the way or exist all the way through the pallet. And usually they can either be 2- or 4-way pallets. They are the most common pallets in the industry. And obviously there's a whole industry of recycled, reused wood that goes into making these, because usually when it falls apart, you can beat it back together with a couple nails and you know, another pallet's worth of wood. Just throw some more deck boards on, and you can quickly remake this pallet without a whole lot of effort. A skid is a pallet with no bottom deck board. So if you don't have deck boards on the bottom, the potential is you could have a skewed pallet that's able to become a diagonal pallet instead of a straight pallet. That being said, it's a cheaper pallet. It generally operates very similarly to a stringer pallet, etc. And that's that. That's a lot of that information. Oops, so sorry. Moving on to the black pallets without touching my mouse, to move to the next slide. These are block pallets. So they actually are specific blocks instead of whole stringers that allow your products to be your pallets to be 4-way entry, which helps some products because you are encouraging the forklift to be able to enter the pallet wherever it needs to enter to be able to put it into the truck, as opposed to having to turn it over and over again if it's a 2-way entry pallet. A 2-way entry pallet, obviously, you can only enter in 2 directions, 4 you can enter in all 4. That being said, if you have a product that should only touch the forks on one side, if there's more packaging or it's heavier on that side, you can make it a 1-way pallet. So there are benefits, there are pros and cons to block pallets and pallet entry points. So moving on, in terms of what's a good pallet versus a bad pallet, which obviously there are good block pallets or good stringer pallets, there are bad block pallets or bad stringer pallets. So this is not necessarily geared towards you must have one versus the other. It's more so saying if you choose to put your product on a pallet, it cannot be broken. And I realize I have a typo on there. I apologize. I've got 2 out of this whole presentation. I'm going to make sure I fix these before I put it online. But the individual parts can be repaired or replaced. As I said before, pallets generally are, most pallets that you're going to have in your warehouse are generally like a 3rd, 4th, 5th generation pallet. So that being said, because they are not completely brand new pallets, they usually have nails that are sticking out of them and can very easily just cut your box. So as you're moving your boxes on and off the pallet, it's really simple to see that the boxes, you might not see that the nail's head is sticking out of the wood, but you will see if you look underneath your box that all of a sudden there are these lines, and they're usually curves that just like, it looks really bizarre pattern on the underside of your box, and you'll know that that pallet needs hammered down again. Unfortunately, a lot of folks are not noticing that in their warehouses. Pallets end up destroying and ripping apart cartons very easily, and because it's on the bottom of your carton, you're not necessarily noticing that before it gets shipped. So if you were part of the seminar before this one today, you'll know that carton strength is reduced every time you cut into it. If you're cutting into it with a bunch of nail heads, you're still losing carton integrity and structural ability for that carton to bear weight, to be resistant to punctures, etc. And so now you're literally using a nail to cut into it. It's probably not a good thing for your carton. Make sure that you're heat treating your pallets. If you're using some weird wood that you're finding, it might be damp, etc. You could have bug infestations. Just be careful in that case. I've actually seen pallets, dirty pallets go into facilities and wood lice enter those facilities, mites, just weird stuff, and then all of a sudden you need a pest control service. And your products, especially if they are upholstered, are absorbing any type of fumigation smells, and then the customer can complain about stench and chemical additives, etc. So just to be completely on the safe side there, make sure that you've heat treated your wood, that it's not going to grow anything or release anything into your warehouse. I say this because it has happened, and the after effects are absolutely terrible. Obviously, recycled wood pallets are accessible to use, but they don't last as long. So just keep in mind how many times you're cycling through these things. If you're purchasing them from a pallet recycler, those are usually like third, fourth generation pallets, and you need to look out for things like falling apart deck boards, variation in deck board distance, which we'll talk about in a second, and then those nails, among other things. So in this case, I do want to point out, A, the deck boards are broken. B, they are too far apart where they are a variable distance apart, which obviously makes it really difficult to be able to stack your products on it without them falling through, but also making sure that you're putting the load-bearing parts of your box on load-bearing parts of your pallet, which we'll talk about in a second. So in this case, the deck boards are really close together, but in this, it's just kind of a nightmare here. You're missing, this is definitely a skid, because most likely there are nails sticking out of the bottom instead of there being stringers and deck boards on the bottom, or deck boards attached to the stringers, I should say. You have a hole up here where you have a broken deck board, and at least you have a hammer to fix it. Maybe we're on the right track. But because of the lack of the bottom deck boards, most likely this pallet is going to take different shapes, and it's going to wiggle from side to side, as each of these are simply going to be able to rotate to be able to create like a trapezoidal shape instead of a rectangular one. So it's just something to think about. In essence, if you're going to use a pallet under your products, it should not look like these two. If they look like these two, you're going to have carriers inclined to remove them, because it's a liability for them, it's a liability for your product, and they don't want to be responsible if this deck board finally breaks and your product ends up missing a box. They're going to have a claim against them. They're not going to like it. So what they're going to do is either remove all your products and put it on a different pallet. They're probably not going to stretch wrap it again. They're probably not going to strap it again. It's for the sake of having a forklift be able to move it around. Or they're going to floor load it. And if you haven't labeled every single one of those boxes on that pallet to indicate what customer it's going to and what order it's from, you're going to have lost product anyway. So it's not a good idea to use a pallet, because it will either lead to damage, a refusal of shipment, lost, missing product, etc. On to the next page. So in this case, I just want to show some really good palletization methods. First off, you want to make sure that you have something to spread the load. If you have a really heavy product, or you have a product with feet that could potentially puncture or put weight in between the deck boards, put a load spreader on. I always recommend it. It's a great way to prevent damage for these types of palletized shipments. Literally get 2 pieces of corrugate or a piece of really thick, high-quality corrugate and put it underneath whatever you're putting on the pallet. It's a really effective method at redistributing weight and preventing any fall through. Make sure that your deck boards are not more than 4 inches apart. If they are, A, I'm going to give you a stern talking to. But B, if you don't have a load spreader, as I said before, your corner of your product may not end up on the pallet on the deck board, which means the part of your box that's supposed to bear weight won't have anything that it can actually bear weight onto, because it's going to be just floating in midair, and that's not good for your box or your product or the pallet, because then that next baseboard can very easily break. Like if this one wasn't here, this one would probably collapse inward. You need to make sure that you put your products perpendicular to the deck boards on a pallet. So if you have deck boards running this way, it's probably not a good solution to put this pallet on it that way. If you want perpendicular, so if you have a long product going this way, your deck board should be running this way. And hopefully you guys can see my mouse as I'm making these gestures, otherwise I can see that'd be really confusing. So this is a good example. You have some products. Unfortunately, in this case, you weren't the example is that this box would have fallen through or not been able to sit perpendicular to one of the deck boards. So a load spreader was indicated to be used here. And then one thing I do want to mention is to be able to keep your products on a pallet, please, please, please use bidirectional strapping. I've seen way too many products be shot off the pallet or off parts of the pallet and then be hanging off and kind of doing a weird teeter-totter because they're only strapped in one direction instead of being strapped in both. So just think about a bowling ball, like you've got to strap it down at least two ways, otherwise she's going to pop out and keep going. And your product is a heavy, dense bowling ball in most cases. I recognize most of you aren't selling bowling balls, but it is a product that responds to physics. So it will continue to be in motion until something causes it to stop, and that something is usually impact or a wall, not a good thing. So this is the last portion, and I know that the seminar is going really quickly. This is a slightly shorter one. I do want to give time for questions at the end if anyone has questions about either what they learned in the last webinar or this webinar or just wants to talk about pallets. But quickly speaking, here are some essentially paper pallets. You can make pallets out of corrugated. So those of you who joined the last webinar saw that you can have really strong corrugate and you can make pallets out of it. So in this case, it is technically a stringer pallet. You have a stringer. You have a full bottom deck board, which is amazing. It's very helpful for products for weight, stability, strength, etc. You have a four-way entry pallet, which is it's great. And this thing, because of the way that the fluting is in the stringers themselves, up and down, it can bear a lot of weight. Most likely you're not going to put more than 2,000 to 3,000 pounds on this thing, so it'll be fine. And it's a lot lighter. All of these are a lot lighter than wooden pallets. So I'm just going to quickly talk through what each of these is, and then I'll go through and just quickly discuss them. So the next one, moving over, this is a combination pallet. So this is corrugate, and it's a stringer pallet, but it doesn't have bottom deck boards, which is okay in this case. It has actual columns, so think like a paper towel core. And that's what's creating the blocks themselves. So block pallet, and it has some, it does have like some deck boards, but they're running parallel to the method, not perpendicular of the method of the pallet. You have a full bottom product touching deck board, which is also, as I said before, great. All of these do. And you have the strength because these are columns that, again, this can hold up a significant amount of weight without any problem. This top panel, different though than this, is honeycomb, as is this one, where the block pallets are made out of honeycombs themselves. Honeycomb material is able to absorb a lot of impact. It's able to crush and protect your product. So if you want to have a pallet that actually has impact absorbing capabilities, these are great options. These are kind of options number one, and then this is option number two, where the corrugate doesn't have as much air between the layers as honeycomb does. Those are literally vertical columns, but between them it's a honeycomb filled with air. And so that air helps distribute impacts. In this case, it has a little less air. It's still good at absorbing and distributing weight and impact, but the honeycomb material itself is great and much better than corrugate. So I'll just quickly go through in terms of the opportunities, pros and cons of these. So the biggest concern, as you probably imagine with using these types of materials is that they are generally very easy to destroy with forklifts, especially the one on the far right. This is probably your cheapest pallet option because you can buy adhesive-lined blocks and attach them wherever you need to on your pallet to create a pallet. You can do 2 layers of honeycomb if you want, one on top, one on the bottom. But as soon as one of these legs gets punctured by a forklift, it's gone. And then you have a very weirdly wobbly pallet, which is then increasing your risk of damage, unfortunately. So even though you're adding these layers of impact protection and absorption, and it's a light pallet, and you're creating this beautiful deck board, weight distribution liner, it's going to effectively be thrown away most likely by a carrier if any of these legs are destroyed visibly or torn off. My apologies. So the next piece of this is you don't necessarily see these very frequently in the industry, and there are many players going into this side of palletization to say, okay, you don't want my wooden pallets because I can't make them perfectly sized. I can make my paper pallets any size you want, and on top of that, they're literally cheaper than wooden pallets. And in those cases, I think the industry is starting to warm up to the idea of having a, unfortunately, penetrable pallet that absorbs moisture, can be destroyed by forklifts. But if the folks operating the forklift see this more and more, they're going to learn how to react to it better and better. And so there is opportunity. I think this is actually kind of the way of the future. This is a better solution for most products. If you're going to send something out on a pallet, this is what I would recommend moving forward, both to prevent any of those poor pallets, broken pallets from entering your distribution environment or your facility, but also in general as this is easier for the customer if they somehow do receive the pallet to get rid of. It's recyclable. It's generally much more sustainable than throwing away a pallet. And it's so much lighter that it actually reduces transportation costs overall for the trucking industry. So it's an interesting kind of on the up and up product that is available. I would say to prevent damages from forklifts, I would go to either these 2 products. The cheapest version with the most impact protection would be this one. You've heard the pros and cons in terms of using that one. I won't go over them again, but just keep in mind the industry right now is used to wood pallets. Until there's a significant shift, there are some big players moving over, but until there's a significant shift to these things, they will get more destroyed. They will get destroyed more often than if all products were shipped on these types of pallets, because just folks aren't just used to using them yet. So that's actually the end of the information in this webinar. I'm going to unmute folks, and if you have, I'm happy to answer. I'm actually going to stop the recording.